On the previous devlog, I went over my process for getting started on my first game, so check that out if you want to know how this project began. On this video, I'll go over the progress I made since the last time. Now that I had built the basic mechanics for the game, I moved on to designing a few more rooms. I started by sketching the rooms on paper, focusing on teaching the rock, paper, scissors mechanic to the player. I wanted to do this through gameplay rather than showing a tutorial on screen, so I approached the level design with that in mind. The second room, for example, has 2 enemies and a single weapon. The enemy obstructing the exit can't be killed with a sword. If the player tries to kill this enemy with a weapon, they would be killed instead. This is very likely to happen to a player not yet familiar with the mechanics of the game, so I thought it was important that there were no big penalties or setbacks, so the player simply respawns and the room resets. The only other possible option is to grab the sword and kill the other enemy with it. This enemy then drops its own weapon after being defeated, which the player can now grab to clear the room. So the goal of this room is to hopefully teach the player 2 concepts. Enemies can be killed by specific weapons, and enemies sometimes drop their own weapons. I think playtesting these first few rooms will be really important in the future to make sure these concepts are being conveyed clearly through gameplay. For the following rooms, I began to slowly ramp up the difficulty to introduce new concepts and test the player on what they had learned so far. After designing the layout for a few rooms, I went on to build them and test them in GameMaker. Designing the levels on paper first and building them later was a great choice since it allowed me to focus on enemy placement and room layout first. This made the actual building of the levels a lot more efficient since all the design choices had already been made and all I had to do then was to simply place the objects on the map. As I was designing the levels, I bumped into a bit of a problem. The current mechanic of weapon hierarchy was too shallow to make up interesting levels with on its own, and some rooms could be solved in a linear way. So there was no room for error or exploration. So in order to make things more interesting, I decided to add 2 new mechanics. First, enemies sometimes drop their own weapons, as I mentioned earlier. This means that now the player will need to explore the room and think about their actions before they can advance on to the next room. The second new addition was to introduce weapon durability. The initial idea was that all weapons would break after 1 use. However, I decided to give some weapons 2 uses in order to introduce a bit of variation and depth of gameplay. I found this to be a bit tricky to implement and I ended up going for a less than ideal solution. I'll probably need to revisit this code in the future, but for now it works. Next, I added chests that can contain weapons, coins and keys needed to exit some of the levels. And finally, I updated the enemies so that they face the player when they are in their line of sight to make them a bit more menacing. Now that I had a handful of levels, I thought I would start working on the graphics, mainly because I wanted to introduce the UI and get a feeling for the sizing of all the objects. As I mentioned in the previous devlog, I chose to go for one big graphics for the sake of simplicity. So I went into Sprite and I started working on the main elements for the UI. I started by drawing different types of keys, coins, swords and armor until I got something I was happy with. Being the first time I designed any kind of sprite, this process took quite a long time, but after a few iterations and after drawing a font too, I had a UI that I was happy with. I continued by designing the weapons, more armor pieces, chests, the gates for the exits. As you can see, all of these sprites went through a bunch of iterations before getting to their final versions, and I'm sure I'll keep updating them as I go along. Finally, I made a tile set and put all these pieces together into a mockup to see how all the assets look together, and to get a feel for the sizing and proportions of all the elements. So that's all for this devlog. Next, I'll be working on the UI and implementing all the new assets into the game, so hopefully we'll have something that's playable and a bit nicer to look at. Consider subscribing if you want to see more devlogs and follow me on Twitter if you want to see more pixel art content and more regular updates. See you next time.